The laughter echoed across the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, sharp and cruel, as a powerful Chinese billionaire pointed at a young black waiter like he was less than human. She mocked his skin, his work, even his dignity, confident that no one at the table understood the language she used. The American businessman smiled weakly, desperate to impress her, never realizing that every insult was cutting deeper than they could imagine. But what they didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to suspect, was that the man she ridiculed had a secret. A secret far greater than any fortune she controlled. He wasn't just a waiter. And when the moment came, his response would not only silence her laughter but shatter the arrogance of an entire empire. What happened next would become the most expensive lesson a billionaire ever paid for. Before that night, Marcus Reed was just another face in the background of New York's glittering skyline. At 32, he worked quietly as a waiter at Jade Dragon, the city's most exclusive Asian restaurant. His black uniform blended in with the polished floors, the gilded walls, the endless parade of billionaires and diplomats who came to strike deals over $1,000 bottles of wine. To the guests, Marcus was invisible. Just another server, another hand placing plates and pouring drinks. But behind the calm smile and steady steps was a man whose life had once been very different. Marcus had a master's degree in Asian studies, spoke multiple languages, and had spent years working in international relations. He once sat at tables of power, advising leaders on how to bridge cultures. Until one false accusation destroyed everything: his career, his reputation, his future. Cleared of all charges but branded by suspicion, Marcus had been pushed out of the world he loved and forced into a job that barely kept him afloat. Still, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He showed up on time, treated every guest with respect, and swallowed the daily humiliations that came with serving the rich. But deep down, he knew his story wasn't over. He was waiting, perhaps without even realizing it, for the moment when life would give him the chance to prove that who he was could never be defined by a uniform or the color of his skin. That chance would come on a rainy Tuesday evening, when one of the wealthiest women in Asia walked into the restaurant with her entourage. She carried herself like royalty, and everyone around her treated her as such. Everyone, except Marcus. For when her arrogance turned cruel, and laughter filled the room at his expense, she had no idea the man she mocked was far more dangerous to her empire than she could ever imagine. The night had started like any other shift. Marcus carried trays of wine bottles and polished silver, gliding between tables with quiet precision. But when Madame Zhao swept into the room, a billionaire from Shanghai with a reputation for ruthless deals, the atmosphere shifted. Her presence was magnetic, commanding. She was accompanied by 5 American businessmen, all desperate to impress her, laughing at every half-smile, nodding at every word. From the moment Marcus approached their table, he could feel her eyes on him. Sharp, cold, and dismissive. When he set down the glasses, she muttered something in Mandarin, smirking as the businessmen chuckled nervously, even though none of them understood a word. Marcus understood perfectly. She had called him a monkey. He didn't flinch. His hands were steady as he poured the first glass, even as she continued in Mandarin. Look at him, probably never even finished school. People like that should be scrubbing toilets, not serving us. The businessmen laughed, eager to share in the joke, though they had no idea what was being said. They only knew Zhao's tone was mocking, and Marcus was the target. The laughter grew louder, filling the restaurant like a cruel echo chamber. Marcus lowered his eyes, but inside, a storm was building. Every word cut deep, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. For months he had endured sneers, dismissive glances, whispered insults when guests thought he couldn't understand. But this time was different. This time, the insults were sharper, deliberate, designed to humiliate him in front of a room full of strangers. Madame Zhao leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine as if it were liquid gold. In America, she continued in Mandarin, they call this progress. Giving jobs to people like him. As if that changes what he is. She lifted her glass in mock salute, and the businessmen raised theirs in awkward imitation, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Marcus kept serving, silent, calm, but his mind was racing. Every word she spoke was evidence. Every insult, every slur was ammunition she was handing to him on a silver platter. Without realizing it, she was digging her own grave. The humiliation escalated with every course. As Marcus set down the appetizers, she laughed and told the men, "This one probably has 10 children with 10 different mothers. That's how these people live, caves and ignorance." The businessmen shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty, but no one dared challenge her. Her wealth was too great, her influence too vast. Marcus's hands trembled, but not with fear. They trembled with restrained fury, with the weight of years spent being underestimated, overlooked, and discarded. Only he knew that behind the uniform was a man fluent in 5 languages, a man who had once sat across from ambassadors, a man who had dedicated his life to building bridges between cultures. And tonight, that man was being called an animal. When dessert arrived, the cruelty reached its peak. Madame Zhao motioned Marcus closer, pointing at him like one might point at a stray dog. "You," she said in broken English, "dance for us. Like a monkey. Show us something funny." The room fell silent. Even the businessmen froze, caught between horror and cowardice. Marcus straightened, the tray still in his hands. His eyes met hers for the first time that night, and for a moment she faltered. There was something in his gaze, a calmness that didn't belong to a servant. But she brushed it off with a laugh, raising her glass again. "See? He knows his place," she told the men in Mandarin. "He won't even look at me properly." What she didn't know was that Marcus had been recording everything. His phone, tucked neatly into the pocket of his apron, captured every insult, every sneer, every proclamation of racial superiority she thought no one could understand. And now, as the weight of her latest command hung in the air, Marcus made a decision. Not yet. Not here. But soon. Because the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one shouting. It's the one who stays silent, watching, waiting, and preparing for the perfect moment to strike. Madame Zhao smirked, dismissing him with a wave of her jeweled hand. The businessmen tried to pick up their conversation again, but the tension lingered. Marcus moved back toward the kitchen, each step measured, each breath deliberate. He wasn't broken. He wasn't defeated. He was ready. And when his response came, it would shake not just the table she sat at, but the empire she believed would protect her from ever facing consequences. The laughter had gone on long enough. Marcus stood in the middle of the dining hall, his hands steady as he cleared the last glass from Madame Zhao's table. The air was thick with arrogance, the sound of her voice filling every corner of the restaurant. She was in her element, intoxicated by her own power, assuming that every sneer and insult would vanish into the air as soon as they left her lips. But this time, something shifted. Marcus placed the final plate down, straightened his shoulders, and looked directly into her eyes. For the first time that night, his gaze didn't drop. For the first time, he didn't swallow the insult. And in a voice calm, measured, and impossibly fluent, he spoke, in Mandarin. "Madame Zhao," he said, his pronunciation sharp, precise, and elegant. "I believe you are confusing this restaurant with a circus. You came here to dine, not to degrade human beings." The words sliced through the room like glass shattering on marble. The businessmen froze mid-breath. The waiters at the back stopped in their tracks. Madame Zhao's face drained of color, her jeweled hand trembling as she gripped the stem of her glass. "You what?" she whispered in English, but Marcus did not switch back. He continued in Mandarin, his tone as smooth as silk, but carrying the weight of thunder. "I understood everything you've said tonight. Every insult. Every slur. Every poisonous word you thought no one could hear. You mocked my skin, my dignity, my very humanity. But you forgot one thing. Respect is not something your money can buy. It is something you earn." The businessmen exchanged stunned glances. One of them muttered, "My God, he speaks better Mandarin than she does." Madame Zhao's mask of arrogance cracked. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, searching for control. You tricked me," she hissed, but Marcus was already moving forward, his voice unwavering. "For 8 months I've worked here, serving people like you. Silent. Invisible. But before that, I was not a waiter. I was Dr. Marcus Reed, a cultural advisor for the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, a lecturer on Chinese philosophy, a man who once sat across from presidents and ministers, negotiating the very trade deals your company thrives on." Gasps spread through the restaurant. The name struck a chord. Some of the businessmen had heard it before, buried in academic journals or whispered in diplomatic circles. Marcus pulled his phone from his apron and held it up, the red recording light glowing like a flame. "And tonight I recorded everything. Every word. Every insult. Every declaration of superiority that you boasted about so proudly. This device holds the truth of who you are, not the billionaire you pretend to be, but the coward who hides behind cruelty." Madame Zhao's hand shook so violently her wine glass toppled, red liquid spreading like blood across the tablecloth. "You wouldn't dare," she stammered. Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping into a calm that carried more weight than any shout. "I already have." For the first time in her life, Zhao's laughter was gone. Her arrogance melted into something far rarer, fear. The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, broken only by the sharp clicks of phone cameras as diners discreetly recorded the unfolding drama. What had begun as one woman's mockery had transformed into a public reckoning. "You thought I was a monkey," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "But tonight the world will see the truth. And it will not be me who is humiliated." The final words hung in the air like a verdict. Madame Zhao's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The businessmen at her table looked away, ashamed, unwilling to be linked to her downfall. For the first time, she realized she was alone. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, his expression calm, his dignity intact. He had not raised his voice. He had not thrown a punch. And yet, he had just delivered a blow more devastating than any fist could. The air was electric, the tension unbearable, as every eye in the restaurant waited for what would come next. Would she lash out in fury? Would she beg for mercy? Or would the weight of her own words finally crush her? Marcus stood tall, the storm behind his eyes finally released. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. When the oppressed finally speak, the powerful have no defense. The next morning, the story was everywhere. What had started as whispers in the Jade Dragon dining hall spread like wildfire across social media. Diners who had secretly recorded the confrontation posted their videos online. Within hours, millions of people had watched the moment when a black waiter stood tall and answered a billionaire in her own language. Headlines blared. "Powerful businesswoman humiliates herself in New York. Waiter turns tables on racism in Manhattan's elite restaurant. Dr. Marcus Reed, from Target to Triumph." Madame Zhao's empire trembled. Partners withdrew. Contracts collapsed. The Chinese consulate issued a statement distancing themselves from her remarks. In the space of 48 hours, the woman who had strutted through Manhattan as untouchable was suddenly radioactive. But Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't post celebratory messages. He didn't rub salt into her wounds. Instead, when reporters crowded outside his modest apartment, he stood calmly and said, "This isn't just about me. It's about dignity. It's about every person who has been mocked, dismissed, or erased because of the color of their skin." For Marcus, the true victory wasn't Zhao's downfall. It was the visibility of a story that too often goes unseen. People around the world, students, workers, immigrants, single parents, saw themselves in his silence, in his restraint, and in his final act of defiance. They saw proof that dignity could shine even in the darkest humiliation. 3 weeks later, Marcus was invited back to Columbia University to deliver a lecture, not as a guest, but as a professor. The same halls that once whispered about his alleged disgrace now rang with applause as he spoke about cross-cultural understanding, racism, and the importance of truth. His students didn't just see him as a teacher. They saw him as living proof that injustice could be fought without losing one's humanity. Madame Zhao, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. The empire she had inherited cracked under the weight of scandal. Her arrogance, once her armor, became her downfall. In interviews, businessmen who had sat at her table admitted their shame. One of them said, "That night taught me something I should have learned long ago. You judge a man not by his uniform, but by his character." And perhaps that was the real legacy of that evening. Not the contracts lost. Not the viral videos. But the ripple effect, the way one act of quiet courage exposed not only one person's cruelty, but the systems that allow prejudice to thrive in silence. Time comes, when prejudice raises its voice in your presence, will you stay silent? Or will you, like Marcus, find the courage to speak? Marcus knew this wasn't the end of racism. He knew there would be more humiliations, more battles, more silent rooms where people like him would be dismissed before they even opened their mouths. But he also knew something else. Every story like his adds to a larger movement, a growing wave that no amount of wealth or arrogance can stop. As he stood one evening outside Jade Dragon, watching the city lights flicker against the glass towers, Marcus thought about how easily things could have gone differently. What if he had stayed silent? What if he had bowed his head one more time and let the laughter roll past him? No one would have known. No one would have cared. Another night, another insult, another man swallowed whole by the weight of prejudice. But he hadn't stayed silent. And because of that, the world saw something powerful, the moment when silence broke, and truth spoke louder than wealth. This story isn't just about a billionaire and a waiter. It's about the countless people who are underestimated every single day. It's about the teachers mistaken for janitors, the workers overlooked for promotions, the children told they'll never be more than their neighborhood. It's about the cruelty of prejudice, but also the quiet, unstoppable force of dignity. Marcus's triumph was not that he embarrassed his oppressor. It was that he proved a truth that resonates far beyond one restaurant, that the worth of a person cannot be measured by their skin, their title, or their paycheck. It is measured by their humanity. So ask yourself, how many more stories like Marcus's are unfolding right now, unseen, unheard, unrecorded? How many voices are still being silenced by laughter in rooms where no one dares to speak up? And most importantly, because sometimes, a single voice can shake an empire.